He served his country with honor, built a peaceful life for his kids in a quiet town, but when the school they trusted turned against them, with whispers, slurs, and silence, this military father didn't back down. They called him a troublemaker. They tried to push him out. But he documented every word, every bruise, every lie. And when the system failed his children, he brought that system to its knees. This is not a story about revenge. This is a story about discipline, dignity, and one man's refusal to be ignored, because justice doesn't shout. It shows up every single day. Do you believe change starts with one voice? Then stay with us, and when the credits roll, tell us, would you have stood your ground? Like, comment, and subscribe if you believe silence is never the answer. The alarm went off early morning just like it always did. Sergeant Calvin Reed didn't need it. He was already up, sipping his first cup of black coffee in the quiet kitchen, scrolling through headlines he didn't care much about. The house was still, peaceful. It wouldn't be for long. Upstairs, Taylor and Jordan were beginning to stir. 13 and 10, the kids had grown into their own routines under Calvin's careful structure, not rigid like the army, but not exactly loose either. Calvin believed in rhythm, in showing up, in handling your business without complaint. By 6, he was flipping eggs while Jordan tried to tie his sneakers with one hand and brush his hair with the other. Taylor mumbled something about math homework as she opened her laptop on the kitchen table. Calvin set the plates down, 3 scrambled egg sandwiches and orange juice like always. You got your presentation today, Tay. Taylor nodded, eyes on the screen. Yeah, science fair set up too. Jordan chimed in, I'm helping, I get to hold the poster. Calvin smiled, team effort, that's what I like to hear. It was just another morning. The kind Calvin had worked years to build, one where his kids felt safe, where nothing cracked or slipped or caught fire. They had moved to Ridgewood 2 years ago, not because it was perfect, but because the schools were decent and the streets were quiet. That was enough for a man who had seen war zones and military bases on 3 continents. He drove the kids to school himself, always did. They talked about basketball and a new Marvel movie on the way there. Nothing serious, no lectures. He parked in the same spot near the front of Ridgewood Middle and walked them to the front entrance. The flag was half raised, flapping in the wind. And then there he was, Assistant Principal Lawson. Lawson had that tone, that practiced, polite drawl people in Ridgewood used when they didn't want to sound too hateful but didn't quite know how to hide it either. He was standing by the doors with his clipboard, giving Calvin and the kids a look that was just off. Not rude, just watching too long. Calvin gave a polite nod. Morning. Lawson barely nodded back. Mornin', Sergeant. Calvin didn't linger. He pressed a hand to each of his kids' backs. Go on, be great. They disappeared inside. Lawson's eyes followed them. Calvin noticed. He didn't say anything, just walked back to the truck and drove off, the quiet nag of something tugging at the back of his thoughts. The day passed without incident. Calvin finished his part-time shift at the Veterans Resource Center, caught up on bills, and prepped dinner early. He always aimed to be home when the kids walked in, but today they were late. When the door finally opened, Taylor came in first. Her face looked tight. She didn't say much. Behind her, Jordan walked slower than usual, his backpack slung over one shoulder. Calvin stood from the kitchen table. Everything okay? Jordan shrugged, then flinched slightly as he took off his hoodie. Calvin saw the edge of a bruise under his collarbone, purplish and fresh. What happened? Calvin's voice didn't rise, but it'd wait. Taylor answered before her brother could. Some 8th graders were shoving him during recess. One of them called him a freak kid with gay dads. A teacher saw it and told Jordan to walk it off. Calvin stared at her, then at Jordan. What teacher? I don't know her name, Taylor said. New, tall, blonde hair. Jordan rubbed his arm. She laughed. I think she was friends with the big kid. That night, Calvin didn't sleep. He wasn't new to disrespect. During his years in uniform, he'd learned how to walk through it, but this was different. This was his son. His daughter, this was a school he trusted, and he had followed every rule, done everything by the book. The next morning, Calvin dropped the kids off and didn't leave. He waited outside the school office until someone finally asked what he needed. He asked to see the principal, Mrs. Halbrook. They told him she was in a meeting. He waited anyway. 20 minutes later, she came out. Mrs. Halbrook was all smiles, thin, rehearsed smiles. Sergeant Reed, how can I help you? Calvin kept his tone measured. My son was assaulted yesterday, at recess. I'd like to speak to the supervising teacher and see the incident report. She blinked. Assault is a strong word. I'm using it intentionally. I understand. I'll have to look into who was on duty. But unfortunately, recess isn't monitored in the same formal way classroom time is. Sometimes things happen quickly. Calvin nodded once. So you haven't filed a report? She shook her head too quickly. Nothing was brought to my attention until now. I'm bringing it now. She hesitated. Well, we'll need to conduct an internal review before any documentation can be filed officially. He pulled out a small notebook from his back pocket. Would you mind spelling your name and job title for my notes? The shift in her face was immediate, but she gave it to him. Calvin thanked her and left, but not before spotting Assistant Principal Lawson watching through the glass partition down the hallway. Outside, Calvin made 3 phone calls, one to the school board administrative line to request a formal meeting, one to the town police department's non-emergency line asking for a consultation, and one to a friend he hadn't spoken to in years, a civil rights lawyer named Emma who used to work for the Army JAG Corps. He didn't know where this was going yet, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let it slide, not for his kids, not in his house, not on his watch. The morning after his visit with Principal Halbrook, Calvin sat on the porch with a mug of coffee gone cold. He hadn't slept much again. The wind carried the smell of cut grass and something sharp beneath it, like the edge of tension before a storm. His eyes stayed fixed on the school across town, though all he could see from here was the tree-lined street and quiet driveways. Ridgewood had always looked clean on the outside. That was part of the problem. Inside, Taylor was quietly getting Jordan's lunch ready. They hadn't spoken much since the day before. Both kids had slipped into the kind of silence Calvin recognized from his years in the service, the kind you wore when you didn't know who to trust. When it came time to drop them off, Jordan hesitated at the door. I don't want to go, he said plainly. Taylor looked at Calvin but didn't say anything. Calvin knelt in front of his son. What's got you scared? Jordan didn't answer right away. His hands fiddled with the hem of his sweatshirt. It's not just the kids. Mr. Lawson saw me yesterday and said, still running to daddy every time you get a boo-boo, in front of everyone. Calvin kept his tone calm. Who else was there? 2 teachers, a janitor. Nobody said anything. Taylor added, they just walked past like it didn't happen. Calvin nodded once and stood. All right. He took the keys from the hook. Go wait in the truck. The kids left without question. Calvin grabbed a yellow notepad from the table and wrote down the exact quote Jordan had given him, the date, time, and location. He added a note, witnesses present, and underlined it. By the time he pulled into the school parking lot, his mind was already building the next few steps. This time, he walked them all the way to the front office. The secretary greeted him with the same overly cheerful tone she'd used the day before, but Calvin didn't bother with pleasantries. I'm here to follow up on yesterday's meeting, he said. Principal Halbrook isn't available right now. I'll wait. The secretary blinked. It could be some time. I brought coffee. He took a seat in the front lobby, not moving even when staff walked by, whispering or trying not to make eye contact. 45 minutes passed before Halbrook appeared, her heels clicking sharp against the tile. Sergeant Reed, she said with a breathy exhale, I wasn't expecting. I'm following up on the incident report you said you'd file. She paused. I've spoken with our school counselor and a couple of staff members. So far, no one can confirm what your son reported. Calvin tilted his head slightly. So you spoke to people but didn't write anything down. It's standard to investigate informally before committing anything to a record. He opened his notepad. According to Jordan, Assistant Principal Lawson made a remark in front of multiple staff members. I'd like to know who you spoke with and what they said. I'm afraid I can't disclose personnel discussions. I'm not asking for private files. I'm asking what steps were taken. Halbrook's smile strained. Sergeant, I understand your concern, but sometimes children misunderstand what they hear, especially when emotions are high. Calvin's voice dropped steady. I'm not here to argue about what my son might have imagined. I'm here because he was hurt, mocked, and left unsupported. You said you'd take it seriously. I am. Then document it. She hesitated. There's a process. You're stalling. Halbrook's eyes narrowed slightly. Is this a threat? It's a reminder that I've served 20 years protecting this country and I know what due process looks like. This isn't it. She didn't answer. I'll give you until tomorrow to file an incident report and provide a written statement summarizing the internal review. If that doesn't happen, I'll file my own complaint with the district, and if necessary, the Department of Education. He left before she could respond. Back in his truck, Calvin didn't start the engine right away. He sat for a moment, his fingers gripping the wheel, then he pulled out his phone and opened his camera roll. He had pictures of Jordan's bruise. The offensive graffiti from 2 nights ago was still on the side of their wooden fence. He hadn't painted over it yet. He had screen captures of online posts from local kids referencing Taylor and Jordan with coded slurs. He was building a timeline. That night he called Emma again. She picked up after 2 rings. "Talk to me." Principal stonewalling. No paperwork, no investigation, just lip service. "I figured you ready to escalate." "Almost." "I'll loop in a friend at the Civil Rights Division. Quietly, for now, document everything. Every conversation, every witness, every time you get brushed off." "I'm already doing that." "Good, you want to win this, Cal, not just stir the pot." He nodded even though she couldn't see him. "Always." He hung up and went to check on the kids. They were in the living room watching something light on TV, pretending it hadn't been a weird day. Calvin didn't want them burdened with his strategy, but he also wouldn't lie. "Starting tomorrow," he said, "I'm gonna walk you both to class every day, just for a bit." Jordan looked up, eyes wide. "Are we in trouble?" "No, son, I just want to see who's watching." Taylor glanced at him, then nodded quietly. "Okay." At Ridgewood the next morning, Calvin showed up 10 minutes before the first bell. He walked the kids in. Teachers smiled politely as he passed. No one made eye contact for too long. Lawson was nowhere in sight. He lingered a moment outside the main hallway, watching the flow of students and staff. Then he spotted her, the blonde teacher Taylor had mentioned. Tall, young, the kind of posture that came from privilege, not training. She glanced at him once, then looked away fast. He clocked it. As he turned to leave, a custodian approached him in the hallway, an older black man Calvin hadn't met before. "You Calvin Reed?" the man asked in a low voice. "I am." The custodian looked around, then leaned in. "I saw what happened with your boy. They made jokes about it in the staff lounge, called you a troublemaker. Said they're gonna handle it quietly." Calvin's jaw clenched. "Would you be willing to write that down?" The custodian gave a small nod. "If someone else does first." "Understood." He shook the man's hand. "Thank you." When he got back in the truck, he didn't go home. He drove straight to the district office. If Ridgewood thought it could bury this, it hadn't met a man like Calvin Reed, steady, patient, and trained for long fights. Something was wrong at Ridgewood, and he wasn't going anywhere until it got fixed. The next week passed in uneasy silence. Calvin walked the kids into school each morning, notebook tucked into the inside pocket of his jacket. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to change the mood in the hallways. Teachers gave polite nods, some with their eyes a little too wide. Students whispered as he passed. No one wanted to be the next name in his notes. Each morning, he walked Jordan to his homeroom door and gave him the same reminder: "If anything happens, you tell me. You write it down. You don't let anyone tell you it wasn't real." But for a few days, nothing happened. No bruises, no slurs, no graffiti. It almost felt like maybe the tension had passed, like maybe Ridgewood had realized it was easier to back off than push further. Calvin didn't believe that, not for a second. Bullies didn't disappear, they just changed tactics. By Friday, he felt the shift. Jordan was quiet when Calvin picked him up, not tired, not distracted. Quiet in the way Calvin had seen in young soldiers after their first ambush. Eyes forward, mouth shut, no complaints, but something held in the chest like a stone. "You all right?" Calvin asked once they were home. Jordan nodded too quickly. "Fine." Calvin didn't press, not yet. He waited until after dinner, until dishes were washed and the TV buzzed softly in the background. Then he sat beside his son on the couch and waited. Eventually, Jordan spoke. "It happened again." Calvin turned slightly. "What did?" "The teacher, Mr. Holloway. He made me stand up in front of the class during morning announcements. He said," Jordan's voice caught. "He said, Jordan's going to remind us why God made real families, not fabricated ones." Calvin felt something in his ribs go tight. He said that in front of the class. Jordan nodded. Everyone laughed. Some kids looked confused, but no one said anything. Taylor was in the hallway and heard it too. Calvin closed his eyes. "What happened after?" "Nothing, he just kept reading announcements like normal. I sat down and no one looked at me." Taylor confirmed it, word for word. She'd been waiting outside her classroom door when she heard the whole thing. And she'd seen one of the other teachers, Ms. Grant, from the social studies department, glance over, frown slightly, and then keep walking. The next morning, Calvin didn't just walk his kids to school. He requested an immediate meeting with Principal Halbrook, and when the secretary tried to stall him, he made it clear he wasn't leaving until someone listened. 10 minutes later, Halbrook appeared, jaw tight, smile thin. "Sergeant Reed, I wasn't expecting." "I'm done expecting things from this administration," he said calmly. "We need to talk, now." She motioned toward her office. Inside, Calvin laid it out clearly, the remark, The timing, the teacher's full name, Taylor's corroboration, Jordan's emotional state, and most of all, the silence that followed. Halbrook tried to lean on her usual script. "I'll need to speak with Mr. Holloway first." "No," Calvin interrupted. "You'll document this first. You'll file an incident report today. I want it timestamped, I want a copy, and I want written confirmation that the complaint was received and will be addressed within district policy timelines." She blinked, thrown off by how specific he was. "I'd also like to know why none of the prior incidents have resulted in disciplinary action." Halbrook opened a drawer and pulled out a manila folder. "We've conducted preliminary interviews, but without corroborating statements." "You had corroboration. You had my son's testimony, photos, witnesses, and a statement from your own custodian. You've had more than enough to take this seriously." Halbrook shifted in her chair. "Sergeant Reed, I understand your frustration." "No," he said, standing slowly, "you don't." He walked out before she could answer. That afternoon, when Calvin returned to pick up the kids, the graffiti was waiting for him. Someone had spray-painted a slur across the tailgate of his truck, large, red, and unmistakable. Calvin stopped in his tracks when he saw it. Jordan froze. Taylor looked down at the pavement. Calvin didn't shout, didn't swear. He told the kids to wait by the door. Then he pulled out his phone, took photos from multiple angles, and walked straight into the front office. "I need to file a police report," he said to the secretary. Her eyes went wide. Do you want me to call someone?" "No, I already did." By the time an officer arrived, Calvin had already uploaded the photos to a secure folder on his computer. He provided timestamps, footage from his dashcam which caught the outline of a figure approaching the truck an hour before pickup. He handed over a printed summary of the past incidents. The officer, a young man with a buzz cut and careful eyes, took it all seriously, or at least tried to look like he did. "I'll log it as a hate incident," the officer said. "Do you have any suspects?" "Several," Calvin replied, "all working here." The next morning, local police called to inform him that the investigation had been referred to the school district's internal safety board. "Which means," Calvin asked, "they'll handle it administratively." That was when he knew the district wasn't just looking the other way, it was covering for its own. By Monday, Calvin had made up his mind. He pulled Jordan and Taylor out of school for the day and drove them to his old friend Emma's office 3 counties over. They sat in a modest building above a strip of insurance agencies and tax consultants. Emma looked over everything Calvin had documented, the notes, the photos, the names, the silence. "This is textbook," she said. "The school's hoping to wait you out, wear you down until you either move or give up." "They don't know me," Calvin said quietly. "No, they don't." Emma pulled out a legal pad and started outlining next steps: formal letters to the district, a pre-litigation notice, a request for a federal review of Ridgewood's Title IX compliance. She didn't promise fireworks, just a slow, methodical process designed to bring heat exactly where it hurt. On the drive home, Jordan asked the question Calvin had been expecting. "Are we going to win?" Calvin kept his eyes on the road. "We're going to fight, that's what matters." Taylor looked out the window. "I just want people to believe us." Calvin nodded. "They will. We're going to show them so much proof they'll have no choice." That night he didn't sleep much. He filed 3 more statements. He drafted a timeline of incidents. He uploaded everything to a drive folder Emma had set up. And when the sun came up, he brewed his coffee, packed the kids' lunches, and drove them to school like it was any other morning. But this time, as he walked them in, he didn't stop at the entrance. He walked straight to the superintendent's office and dropped off a sealed envelope with his complaint. Then he turned and walked back out, eyes forward, head high, the same way he had always marched into enemy territory. This time, Ridgewood wouldn't get to choose whether or not to listen. The letter Calvin left at the superintendent's office was clean and deliberate. 3 pages. No emotion, no speculation, just a timeline of events, attached documentation, and an official request for an independent review of Ridgewood Middle's disciplinary practices regarding discriminatory behavior. At the bottom, in crisp black ink, he signed his name and added a line that made the district's legal team take pause. "Copy forwarded to Civil Rights Division, U.S. Department of Education." He didn't wait for a response. He went about his week as usual, up early, coffee on, breakfast made, school runs. But behind the rhythm, something had changed. He no longer looked like a man trying to hold back a tide. He looked like someone who had accepted the war and was choosing his battleground. By Wednesday, the first ripple hit. An email from the district arrived in his inbox, written in vague administrative language, thanking him for his concerned parent input and noting that internal discussions are underway. Calvin read it once and closed it. He didn't need vague, he needed action. The real shift came that night. It was nearly 10 p.m. when his phone buzzed, unknown number. He debated ignoring it, but something in his gut told him to answer. Sergeant Reed. The voice on the other end asked, crisp and unfamiliar, speaking. My name is Claire Donnelly. I'm an investigator with the Office for Civil Rights. I received your forwarded documentation earlier this week. I don't typically make unscheduled calls, but I've reviewed your case file, and I believe we should speak sooner rather than later. Calvin sat up straighter, his back suddenly rigid. I'm listening. I can't give formal comment yet, but I'll say this much. Your documentation is unusually thorough. I've seen federal cases with half the clarity. What you're describing is part of a larger pattern we've been investigating across multiple districts in this region. Ridgewood just wasn't on our radar until now. You're saying this isn't isolated, Calvin said. I'm saying you're not the only one. They spoke for almost an hour. Claire asked for more details, more dates, more names. She requested scanned copies of Jordan's school records, Taylor's written observations, and any communication from the school. Calvin had it all ready before the call ended. When he hung up, he sat in the dark living room for a long time. It was a quiet victory, one no one else would see, but it felt like something had clicked into place. He wasn't just shouting into the wind anymore. Someone finally was listening. The next morning, he told the kids. What does that mean? Jordan asked, eyes wide. It means we're not alone, Calvin said, and it means someone outside of this town is paying attention. Taylor didn't speak right away, then she whispered, good. The rest of the week moved slowly. Ridgewood was quieter than usual. Maybe word had started to spread. Maybe someone in the administration got spooked. Calvin didn't care. He stayed on track. More notes, more photos, more quiet conversations with people who had stopped avoiding him. That Friday, he got another call, one he didn't expect. Calvin Reed. That's me. This is Miriam Langston. I used to be the superintendent of Ridgewood schools before I was encouraged to take early retirement. I heard about what you're doing. I'd like to talk. He remembered her vaguely, a quiet woman with sharp eyes and the kind of calm that made people underestimate her. He'd seen her in a few district events when he first moved to town, but she disappeared less than a year later. Why are you reaching out now? He asked. Because I saw what they did to you, she said, and because they did something similar to me, just quieter. I wasn't the right kind of voice for them. I pushed back against discipline disparities and suddenly I was gone. You have evidence. I have everything, she said. Emails, meeting notes, complaints that were buried. I didn't go public back then. I didn't want to make a scene, but seeing what they're doing to your children, I can't stay quiet anymore. They met the next day in a quiet corner booth at a diner 20 miles outside Ridgewood. Miriam came prepared, a flash drive, a binder, photocopies. Her hands trembled slightly as she laid them out, but her voice was steady. They have a pattern, not just against LGBTQ families, but students of color, kids with disabilities. They document things selectively. Discipline data is massaged before it reaches the board. I tried to correct it and they retaliated. Calvin read through the emails. One thread was especially damning, a conversation between Halbrook Lawson and a district official about minimizing noise from sensitive demographics. Another was about Calvin directly. Someone had written, let's keep the vet happy but quiet. He looked up at Miriam's, why now? I was afraid, she admitted, but you're not, and maybe I owe it to the kids still stuck in that place. He nodded, you do. She handed him everything. If you go public, I'll back you on record. Calvin didn't smile, he simply said, thank you. That night he called Emma. She whistled low after hearing the details. This is big, Cal, bigger than Ridgewood. We can use this. With Donnelly involved and now a former superintendent ready to testify, we're moving from complaint to case. What do you need from me? Patience, she said. We're going to bring this the right way. No emotion, no press leaks, just a full, airtight record. I've got that. I know, that's why we're going to win. By Monday morning, Calvin had submitted the new documents to Claire Donnelly. He also filed a Freedom of Information Act request for all district communications involving his children. It was a technical move, but it signaled something loud and clear. He wasn't just pushing back, he was digging in. And then the town started to feel it, not publicly, not in headlines, but in whispers. Teachers stopped smiling in the hallway. One gave him a sympathetic nod. Another avoided him altogether. The school resource officer, usually indifferent, asked Calvin one morning if he needed an escort for his son. Calvin declined, but the offer said plenty. Later that week, as he was leaving the grocery store, a woman stopped him in the parking lot. White, mid-50s, teacher's badge clipped to her purse. I wanted you to know, she said softly, we're not all like them. Calvin nodded, then say something. I'm scared. So was I. She didn't reply, but she didn't walk away either. The cracks were starting to show. By Friday, Calvin received an email from the district legal office, a formal notice that an internal compliance review had been initiated in response to multiple parental concerns. No acknowledgement that he had triggered it, no apology, but movement, at last movement. He printed the email and added it to the folder. Then he picked up Jordan from school, same as always. Same walk, same smile, same steady hand on his son's shoulder. But this time he didn't feel like he was walking alone. He was starting to see piece by piece what Ridgewood never expected, that the quiet man with the military haircut and the worn notebook wasn't just some overprotective parent. He was a strategist, and he had just begun. The first message came on a Tuesday around noon. It was short, just a name and a number, no context. "Hi, my name is Anna. I heard about what's happening with your son. Can we talk?" Calvin read it twice before replying. They met that same evening in a small park near the east side of Ridgewood. Anna was in her 30s, brown-skinned, sharply dressed, and carrying a manila folder under one arm. Her voice trembled slightly when she spoke, but her eyes stayed locked on his. "My daughter was suspended last year for disruptive behavior," she said. "You know what the disruption was?" She asked a teacher why she couldn't write about having two moms for her family tree project. Calvin didn't interrupt, he let her speak. "They told me it was best not to push it, that it would only make her more of a target. They made it sound like they were helping me. I didn't know what to do. I didn't have what you have, evidence, support. I just pulled her out and moved on." She handed him the folder. Inside were photocopies of letters, disciplinary records, and two emails from the school's assistant principal at the time, a different name than Lawson, but the same tone. One line jumped out at him immediately. "We want to avoid encouraging unnecessary social confusion among students." By the end of that week, 3 more families reached out. One had a son expelled for aggression after defending himself against a classmate who called him slurs. Another had a daughter who stopped speaking altogether after a counselor told her she shouldn't talk about her home life at school because it made other kids uncomfortable. A third had tried to go to the school board a year ago and was met with silence. Calvin met each of them in person. He asked questions, took notes, and encouraged them to write formal statements. Some were hesitant, others were relieved. All of them, in one way or another, said the same thing: "We thought it was just us." Emma was floored. "I was expecting one, maybe 2 people to come forward," she said during a late-night call. "But this is a class action in the making." Calvin didn't care about lawsuits. He cared about pressure, about building something so undeniable that Ridgewood's silence collapsed under its own weight. He started organizing the statements. They weren't formal affidavits yet, but they were enough to build momentum. He filed each one into a growing digital archive, time-stamped and watermarked. For every testimony, he cross-checked school rosters, yearbooks, and staff assignments. Patterns began to form: same teachers, same counselors, same quiet removal of inconvenient complaints. Miriam Langston, the former superintendent, helped him confirm it. She still had old reports the district had never published: breakdowns of suspension rates, behavioral referrals, and special parental conduct, flags the administration used to blacklist certain families from volunteering at school events. "They called it preventative vetting," she said, shaking her head. But really, it was just a blacklist for anyone who made them uncomfortable. On paper, Ridgewood looked clean, but the numbers didn't lie, and the numbers were starting to stack up against them. Then the whistleblower came forward. Her name was Jenna Martin, a young administrative assistant who had only worked at Ridgewood Middle for a year before transferring to another school. She had seen Calvin's name trending quietly on social media, part of a thread posted by a local LGBTQ advocacy page. She reached out in a direct message. "I don't want to lose my job," she wrote, "but what they're doing isn't right. I still have copies of some of the files." He met her at a diner on the outskirts of town. She arrived nervous and visibly anxious, looking over her shoulder more than once, but once she started talking, she didn't stop. "They had this system," she explained. "It wasn't in the official records, but they had this shared folder, staff only, where they tag certain students as sensitive or watch list. No legal basis, just a list of names and comments. Things like 2 moms, behavioral risk, or family situation unstable. Your kids were on there, so was Anna's daughter, so were at least 15 others." She had screenshots, notes, timestamps, even internal chat logs where teachers joked about rainbow parents and PC nonsense. It was ugly, and it was real. Calvin didn't flinch as he read. He simply nodded and said, "Would you testify?" She hesitated. "I'd have to think about it." "Think fast," he said gently. "They're going to bury this if we don't move." That night he uploaded everything to Emma and Claire. He didn't sleep. The next morning he received a response from Claire Donnelly. "This has officially escalated into a preliminary federal inquiry. I'll need formal interviews, clearances, Witnesses, we're moving forward. The phrase stuck with him, we're moving forward. It was the first time in weeks that he felt like momentum was truly shifting in their favor, not just resistance, movement, but Ridgewood didn't stay quiet. 2 days later, a story appeared in the local paper. A brief article buried in the education section, reporting that a parent has filed a string of complaints against Ridgewood Middle, citing vague claims of discrimination. The article quoted a school board spokesperson who said the district has always been committed to equity and student success. Calvin recognized the move for what it was: preemptive narrative control, a way to make him look hysterical, unreasonable, alone. But this time he wasn't alone. Emma issued a statement to a regional news outlet clarifying that multiple families had come forward and that a federal inquiry had been triggered. She didn't mention Calvin by name, she didn't need to. A day later, the local radio station brought on a guest, Miriam Langston. When asked why she had left the district, she paused, then said simply, "I left because I tried to do the right thing, and I wasn't allowed to." She didn't say much more, but it was enough. Parents started talking in grocery store aisles. Teachers whispered behind closed doors. A few quiet emails landed in Calvin's inbox, signed anonymously, thanking him for standing up. The district scrambled. Halbrook issued a letter to parents about increased scrutiny and unfounded claims that were distracting from the true mission of Ridgewood schools. Lawson stopped appearing at morning drop-offs. One teacher who had laughed in Jordan's face transferred suddenly to another school. And still, Calvin showed up, with his notebook, with his quiet stare, with his children at his side. Taylor had started sitting a little taller in class. Jordan had stopped asking if they were going to move again. There was a stillness in their home now, not peace, not yet, but something closer to steadiness. The lies were unraveling, and Ridgewood was beginning to feel it. It began quietly. Just a notice in the mail, tucked inside a plain envelope with federal letterhead and no return address. Calvin opened it at the kitchen table while Jordan worked through a spelling sheet and Taylor reheated leftover pasta. He read it twice before saying anything. "It's official," he said. Taylor looked up. "What is?" "They've scheduled the hearing." Jordan leaned sideways in his chair. "Does that mean we're going to court?" Calvin gave a faint smile. "Not court yet, a hearing, formal statements, evidence review, but yeah, this is the start." He didn't dramatize it. He didn't want his kids thinking this was the end of something or the big moment where all wrongs got made right. It was just the next step in a long fight one he had no plans of backing down from. The hearing was set in a small administrative building 2 counties over, a neutral site arranged by the Office for Civil Rights. It wasn't televised, but the media got wind of it anyway. Someone leaked the scheduling notice, maybe from the district office, maybe not. Either way, it was out now. By the end of the week, Calvin's name was in the local paper again, but this time not buried. A headline above the fold: "Veteran Parents Civil Rights Complaint Spurs Federal Hearing." They printed a photo of him in uniform from a community parade years ago. He hadn't even known it existed. The image was old, back when he first moved to Ridgewood, still adjusting to civilian life, still figuring out how to be a father and not just a soldier. When he showed it to Emma, she smirked. "They're trying to soften you up. Makes them look like they support the troops while they're under investigation for hate." "Let them try," Calvin said. "I'm not the one hiding." Outside the hearing building, on the morning of the proceedings, cameras lined the sidewalk. Local news vans, a few larger outlets. One camera crew from a national channel that had started following the case after Miriam's radio interview went viral. They didn't call it a viral moment, but that's what it was: a 48-second clip of a former superintendent saying, "I wasn't allowed to protect my students," followed by silence. It had been viewed over 1 million times in 3 days. Calvin ignored the press as he walked inside. He wore a plain black suit, press shirt, clean shave. Taylor and Jordan didn't come. Emma had arranged for them to stay with her assistant for the day, far from the noise. Inside the hearing room, the district's legal team was already seated, 4 of them. 2 men in expensive suits, 1 woman with a stiff expression, and a 4th man Calvin recognized, the district's longtime counsel, known in town for playing hardball in contract negotiations. They didn't look surprised to see him. The administrative judge was a middle-aged woman with a calm face and no nonsense in her voice. Claire Donnelly sat beside her, flanked by 2 colleagues from the Civil Rights Division. Emma took her seat next to Calvin, placed a thick binder on the table, and gave him a small nod. They didn't begin with speeches. They began with evidence. Claire opened a folder and placed the first page on the projector screen. "This," she said, "is an internal communication recovered from Ridgewood Middle's shared drive. It refers to a student, age 10, labeled as a home environment risk. The student had 2 legal guardians, both male. The remark was made by Assistant Principal Lawson." A murmur passed through the room. Then came another document, the custodial notes about disciplinary flags. then emails with jokes and slurs buried in staff group chats. Then testimony from Jenna, the administrative assistant, read aloud from her deposition. Her words were clear. Staff were encouraged not to report minor incidents involving certain students, especially if their families were considered non-traditional. The superintendent, a new one now not Halbrook, shifted uncomfortably as the judge asked questions about policy compliance. She stammered. She used the word oversight 5 times in one sentence. It didn't help. Then came the video. It wasn't high quality, just a fuzzy recording from a student's phone taken months ago in a hallway. It showed Jordan standing alone while a teacher just out of frame said something muffled but cruel. The class laughed. The teacher didn't correct them. Jordan flinched. Claire let the silence linger after the clip ended. "Do you believe this is consistent with a safe learning environment?" she asked the district's lead counsel. He adjusted his tie. "We don't condone the behavior in that video." "That's not what I asked." Emma stood then, calmly, deliberately. "I have 3 more statements," she said. "From other families, from former staff, and from a former superintendent who warned this board about systemic discrimination 3 years ago and was pressured to resign." The judge accepted the documents. No one from the district spoke. After the hearing, the press was waiting. They swarmed as Calvin exited the building, Emma at his side. A reporter shouted, "Do you think Ridgewood will be held accountable?" Another asked, "What do you want to happen next?" Calvin paused just for a moment. "I want my kids to go to school without fear," he said. "That's all." He didn't say more, he didn't need to. The quote ran on every outlet that night. "I want my kids to go to school without fear." By the next day, the town had shifted again. The school board called an emergency meeting closed to the public. Halbrook was placed on administrative leave. Lawson hadn't shown his face in days. Rumors flew, resignation talks, legal posturing, attempts to settle quietly. Calvin didn't engage with any of it. Instead, he went back to his routine. Coffee, eggs, school drop-off, eye contact with every adult in the building. Jordan walked a little taller now. Taylor spoke louder in class. The pressure was working. One night, a knock came at the door. It was soft, timid. Calvin opened it to find a woman standing on the porch, maybe late 40s, eyes red. She introduced herself as Mrs. Patterson, a teacher at Ridgewood Middle. "I'm sorry," she said, voice breaking. "I saw what was happening and I didn't say anything. I was scared." He nodded, silent. "I've written a letter," she said, holding it out. "You don't have to use it, but I had to say something. Your son, he didn't deserve what happened." Calvin took the letter. "Thank you." She stepped back into the dark and disappeared down the street. Inside, Calvin opened the envelope. It was a full-page statement, handwritten, outlining moments she'd seen, things she'd heard, even who laughed. It wasn't everything, but it was more than silence, and it meant the walls were finally cracking. The hearing had done more than shift the narrative, it had opened a door. Calvin didn't know how long the process would take. He didn't pretend justice would come all at once, but something was different now. Ridgewood was on notice, and the cameras were still rolling. 3 weeks passed before the ruling came down. It arrived in the form of a thick envelope delivered to Calvin's mailbox, official seal stamped on the front. He held it in his hands for a long moment, standing on the front porch in the early morning light. The sun was barely up, the street still quiet. Inside, the coffee maker hissed in the kitchen. The kids were asleep. He opened it slowly, not because he was nervous, but because he'd learned patience. You didn't rush moments like this, you let them arrive fully. The decision was clear. The Office for Civil Rights had concluded that Ridgewood Middle School had engaged in sustained and documented violations of Title IX and equal protection standards. The evidence presented, emails, witness statements, disciplinary records, had been found credible and consistent with a pattern of discriminatory behavior against students from LGBTQ+ households. There was more, a full breakdown of required actions, mandatory equity training for all district staff, immediate reinstatement of removed or withheld services, the creation of a compliance committee with parent oversight, the appointment of a federal monitor to supervise reforms for the next 3 years, and in bold print one line: "The district has failed to act in good faith. Corrective action is not optional." Calvin read it all twice. Then he folded the letter neatly, set it on the kitchen counter, and poured his coffee. He didn't smile, but he breathed deeper than he had in weeks. The fallout came fast. Within days, Ridgewood School Board announced the termination of Principal Halbrook, effective immediately. Lawson resigned before a vote could be taken. The board tried to keep it quiet, but the media didn't allow it. Emma had already sent the full ruling to every major outlet that had covered the story. CNN, MSNBC, even a segment on NPR. The headlines shifted from whispers to statements. Federal investigation finds discrimination at Ridgewood Middle. Military father's fight leads to overhaul of local school district. A town on notice, how one family changed the system. Calvin gave no interviews. He declined offers from networks. He didn't want his face turned into a symbol or a slogan. He'd done what he came to do, that was enough. At the next school board meeting, the first held in public since the ruling, Calvin sat in the back row with Taylor and Jordan at his side. The room was full. Some faces familiar, others new. Some with folded arms and narrowed eyes. Others with quiet nods and small smiles. The board chair, a man who hadn't spoken to Calvin once throughout the ordeal, cleared his throat and opened the meeting with a statement. We recognize the harm caused, we acknowledge the findings, and we accept the consequences. There was no applause, just silence. Calvin preferred it that way. During the public comment period, a few parents spoke up. One thanked the board for taking responsibility. Another asked why it took federal oversight for them to act. A third, a father Calvin didn't know, turned toward him mid-sentence and said, "Thank you, Sergeant Reed, you gave us back our voice." Calvin didn't respond, he just nodded once. When it was over, Jordan tugged on his sleeve. Does this mean it's all fixed? Calvin crouched to his level. It means the system got caught, and now it has to change, but it's not fixed yet, it's just finally being watched. Taylor chimed in, do we still have to go to school on Monday? Calvin smiled, yeah, you do. And they did, but this time when they walked through the doors, something felt different. No one laughed behind their backs. No one sneered, the walls were still the same. The classrooms hadn't changed, but the air was different. The teacher who had ignored Jordan's harassment was gone, replaced quietly over the weekend. A new counselor had been brought in, a young man with a background in trauma support and a resume that didn't try to hide it. And Mrs. Patterson, the one who had shown up on Calvin's porch weeks earlier, now led the school's newly formed equity committee. The first thing she did was invite Calvin to join. He declined. I didn't do this to sit in meetings, he said. I did this so my kids could just be kids. Instead, he offered something else. He volunteered to coach the middle school's flag football team, a position that had been vacant for years. No headlines, no policy, just practice 3 nights a week and a chance for Jordan to run without looking over his shoulder. Word spread quickly through town that Ridgewood's new team had a coach who didn't tolerate nonsense. The kind of coach who showed up early, stayed late, and made kids run laps if they so much as smirked at someone different. And the kids listened. Not because they were afraid, but because they knew he wasn't going anywhere. One evening, after practice, Taylor sat beside him in the bleachers. They talk about you at school now, she said. Oh yeah. Not like bad talking, just like you're someone that matters. He didn't answer right away. Then he said, you matter too, you always did. She nodded, I know, I just think now, maybe they do too. Later that month, the district invited him to a ceremony, something formal, meant to acknowledge community advocates. He declined again, politely. Emma went in his place. She stood at the podium, accepted a plaque on his behalf, and said only, the credit doesn't belong to one person, but the pressure does, and that pressure saved lives. Back at home, Calvin kept everything in a single drawer in his office, the letters, the photos, the case files. He didn't look at them often, but he didn't throw them away either. Some battles were worth remembering. One Saturday morning, he finally painted over the graffiti on the backyard fence. The red spray paint had faded, but the words still lingered if you knew where to look. He covered it with 3 coats of flat beige, then stood back and watched the sun hit the clean wood. It was quiet. Not celebratory, not final, just clean, the way things should have been from the start. In the weeks that followed, more families came forward, not with complaints but with support. One mother started a support group for LGBTQ+ parents in the district. Another created a scholarship fund. A retired teacher offered to tutor students privately who had been pushed out of the classroom unfairly. And every time someone asked how it started, the answer was the same. It started with a father. A father who stayed calm, who didn't shout, who didn't break anything or run away. A father who documented, who waited, who brought the truth into the light with precision and discipline and patience. A father who didn't just protect his children, but changed the ground beneath them.